Hi everybody, I'm back again with another chapter. For those of you just tuning in, I'm currently reading my dad's manuscripts. I'm using it as a way of editing. This has already been live streamed, and when I was live streaming, I was doing the actual markup of the edits. So now I'm just reading for your pleasure and hopefully and mine. For me to practice my reading in front of people as well, even though I'm just reading in front of a camera. Anyway, the current book I'm reading right now is called A Voice in the Darkness, and this is chapter 2. Doleg watched the approaching walls. It didn't seem quite real yet. He found himself still readying his mind for Twarda's suspicious greeting. He was going to have to try and track down the sender of the Prachka, if only to show that he was not responsible for sending it. No, to show those who were willing to listen. There would be many, hopefully not too many, who would make a show of believing but wouldn't really believe any proof at all. Few would consider trying to unseat him on that account. More likely they'd try to make special deals for their support. Length Gwil could not afford any division, not with the Nanisses knocking on the eastern door. How many would see that beyond their own provincial concerns? Plutarch was intensely familiar to him. Slight changes were made each year as the population increased and more buildings added. There were some still old refurbished buildings left from the imperial days. Then there were those that had been battered about in various fights for the city over the years. Some restored with the material taken from other destroyed buildings, some restored with more common stone, to give a patchwork result to the whole. The aqueduct, which carried water from the nearby river, had fallen down in places, and Lantha engineering was not up to the task of repairing that. Doleg had dreamed on occasion of importing people from the Empire to do such repairs. He'd never had the authority to do so, nor had he dared make such suggestions to Twarda. The fact was, there was little money for buildings. War reparations must be first priority. A small party of mounted men came out to greet him, including old Osban Hallraft, who hadn't been on a horse for years. In fact, there weren't many horses up to his weight. His beard was still reddish-brown, but his hair had grayed and retreated back past his crown. He had been Twarda's chief counselor, and most certainly hoped that an immediate show of diligence in greeting the new prince would allow him to keep his place. Well, he could stay for the time being, so far as Doleg was concerned, but he'd have to be willing to take second place behind Padya, perhaps even third place, with Borolus in there as well. Lantha princes were not used to being given the same kind of servile attitudes from their husbands that emperors enjoyed. They still ruled as first among equals, as their forebears had. It was fine to see Hallraft come to Vita, but Doleg was more pleased to see Borolus close behind Hallraft. He wasn't surprised. The old scholar had a way of attaching himself to any group he fancied, and in such a manner that no one questioned his right to be there. He wore dark trousers and tunic with riding boots, much like any of the others. Trying to ride a horse in the imperial scholar's robes he was entitled to would look more than a little foolish. Hallraft spoke first, in a deep, fine voice. "Greetings, Lord Prince. Welcome, even on such a sad occasion." "Thank you, Osban Hallraft. Has anyone been able to trace the sender of the Prachka?" He knew he was being very blunt, not bothering to go through all the proper polite greetings, but this was important. "Not yet, Lord Prince. Some initial efforts have been made, but to no effect." How hard had they tried? It was entirely likely they'd been afraid of what they might find. "That is a matter of great importance, Osban Hallraft. Someone has just murdered a prince of Length Gwil. There's no guarantee they'll stop at just one." Holraft made no change of expression. It was only Doleg's suspicion that the man had made the wrong guess as to the best action to take. The old man turned and spoke quickly in a low voice to a young aide, who in turn wheeled his horse and galloped back to the city. My apologies, Lord Prince. I've sent word to have the investigation pressed. With every moment after the attack, any trace becomes less and less possible, Borlus spoke up. Unlike Holraft, he had a head full of white hair and a neat white beard as well. Holraft turned a frown on him. I regret such things as magic and its foul creatures are not part of my expertise. He made it clear that magic was not something that any person of reputation would deal with. He did not, however, question Borlus's right to be present. Well, my late brother's betrothed is in my train, Doleg said. I'm sure some sort of appropriate quarters have already been made ready for her. Have someone see her to them. I would also appreciate a moment to clean up a little before anyone saddles me with any official duties and decisions that must be made. Certainly, Lord Prince. He was not at all surprised to find Borlus in his outer chamber, sipping wine. I suppose I should be happy you did not insist on sitting at the side of my bath and lecturing me while I was naked? Ha! The old man snorted. We all know too well, Osmond Doleg, that any lecture I gave you would result in you doing your own will, despite all my words. I thought it might be wise to give you more information on the way things have been going. The most important matter would be who killed my brother. The Whitehead nodded. Even so. Well, the usual mistakes were made. For one thing, I myself made the mistake of urging your brother a little too strongly to trust you, with the result that he began to distrust me, and preferred not to have me be in my company. Even I might not necessarily have been able to save him, but I was not given the chance. The big mistake was some dithering and asking, shall we investigate closely, or will we find something the new Lord Prince doesn't want us to find? It's difficult enough to track a Prachka, if one sets about it immediately, and sometimes even a harmless fool of a scholar can't edge his way into the affair. I took what actions I was able to, but I've a feeling I wouldn't have done much better had I come in on it fresh. Someone had taken trouble to add in spells to muddy the waters. The best I could manage were cardinal directions, north and west. So we look for a guilty conscience to the north and west? Use your head, boy! Suddenly the tutor was speaking to the student, who couldn't quite seem to grasp the point of the lecture. What it means is that the guilty party is somewhere to the northwest, which is admittedly a large territory, but add to that the fact that your brother was planning to marry again, and could quite possibly get a son. Who would be the direct heir? Who gains by his death? You mean Tarpral, the present heir? Or rather, his father, Osmond Ladavant, who would probably be reign as regent? But the Prachgal killed Singjil, Tuarta's daughter as well. Would that not rule out Tarpral as candidate? What do you know about Prachka? Doleg looked at him in surprise. What you told us. A magical construct, usually in the form of a cat, but walking on two legs. It's animated by a human soul, given just enough volition to carry out its mission so it can rest. The soul, that is. Borlus nodded, as at a student who had given the correct answer. Correct. And they're tricky things, too. They can usually be guaranteed to go for the person they are aimed at. That done, though, they usually keep killing until they're killed themselves, and depending on how they're made, they may require a good deal of killing. When a person makes a Prachka, they aim it at one target. The assumption is that the prince was the target. That only makes sense. But the Prachka came on Tuarta when he had chosen to make one of his visits to the nursery. Singjil had come to resemble her late mother, whatever faults the prince had, he'd come to care for her greatly. So the Prunchka began to strike with its spirit knife, and among the people it struck was Single. An unfortunate event from Ladavant's point of view, but a case might still be made for T'Pral to be the heir based on Tuarta's naming of him. The lawyers could have a fine time arguing the pros and cons of that one. So there's no solid proof that Ladavant was behind it? None at all. We may never find it either. Persons who hire the making of such foul things as Prunchka rarely allow proof to come to light. Doleg frowned. I still say that T'Pral's candidacy for prince's seat is now a dead issue. Was that intended to be a grotesque pun? It wasn't well thought through. Your brother has frequently given evidence of not trusting you on the princely throne. He named T'Pral heir for the time being. I've no doubt that there are several Osbans willing to convince themselves that you aren't to be trusted to be on the throne, particularly if they think they might gain some small advantage or preferment by supporting Ladavant. So I'll be looking at putting down a rebellion as my first princely act? The land can't afford that. Would you like to hear worse? There are Osban who won't take to Ladavant's rule, even as a regent for his son. There'll be a rebellion, even if you go off and become an acolyte of the third god. It's just that this sort of rebellion will have several factions and take longer to reach a conclusion. Don't let yourself get all puffed up over it. But if you put yourself up for prince, any rebellion can probably be put down in a year's campaign. And while we're campaigning, the Ninisses come over the little river and wipe out the lot of us. Borlas frowned. The only good advice I can give you is to take one problem at a time. Go out and claim the princely seat. Show that you mean to hold it, and carry on from there. All the Osbans who appeared in the prince's hall, while not a majority of the Osbans of Llanthgwyl, seemed to desire a quiet, uncontested succession. Doleg had always displayed a lack of interest in politics because of Tuarta's inevitable reaction to such an interest. One would have thought that a person intent on overthrowing the prince would have kept his interest in political matters secret, but Tuarta had not been entirely logical in his thinking when it came to considering his brother's loyalty or lack thereof. Or lack of it, rather. While carefully avoiding any public interest in politics, however, Doleg had always made sure he knew as much as possible about the attitude of major persons involved. As prince, he realized he was going to have to see to it that he had sources of information, good sources of information, about what his Osbans were doing. Even what they were thinking, alone in their chambers, if that were possible. The Osbans present would almost certainly be favorable to his accession, though they may well change their minds at some time in the future, depending on many things, including the simple fact of who and how powerful were the men against him. But, as Borlas had said, it was up to him to take the principality and go from there. The dress of those who in the hall varied from tunics and cloaks of dyed cloth, as might be found in Great Madoligus itself, all the way to the tanned hides that had some resemblance to the clothing worn by the Ninisses of the High Plains, not to mention all sorts of combinations of the two. He knew for a fact that some Osbans, few of those present, but some who lived on the edges of the principality, preferred to live in the felt tents of their ancestors, rather than the bulky piles of stone and brick and wood that had been inherited from the Empire. They all wore armor, of course. It was against the law and custom to draw a weapon in the presence of the prince, but not one of the Osbans was without enemies. In fact, some of those present tried very hard to avoid meeting some others present because of long-standing enmities between them. If they chanced on each other outside their prince's presence, there was a possibility that weapons and blood would be drawn. He looked them over. "With your will," he said, "I will take the princely throne left vacant by the death of my brother, Tuarda. I will not require full oaths of loyalty just now. That can be held off for some weeks, after the funeral, when more of the Osbands will be summoned. He would have felt more safe if he had asked for oaths immediately, but that would have been false safety. When a greater number of Osbands had gathered, and more discussions held between Osbands might compromise any promise made tonight. On the other hand, the people present here had to know that any immediate hesitation they showed here could well be held against them. The ruthless days of the chiefs of the Confederacy weren't too far off. He certainly hoped that he'd be able to get through this evening without having to take any drastic action. He'd have to make sure that he had some good sources of information, too. However fine and noble it would be to consider all his nobles as loyal to him, it was a fact that some Osbands still felt their ancestors had been cheated, that they themselves ought to have been leaders of the Confederacy. As each noble came up, he paused to go down on one knee before the prince. Many years ago, this would have been a sign of full obedience. Head to the floor, but the imperial agent had declared that this salutation was to be reserved for the emperor alone, and that prince could only require that a man go down on one knee. In Doleg's mind, there were things more important than protocol, such as raising enough money to fight the Nanissas. He had to sit there while each Osband signed or made his mark, then went back to his place. After the funeral, when all Osbands were not yet here and had added their signatures, a copy would be made and sent in to the emperor. It would not be likely seen by the emperor himself. One of his secretaries would send him a note to inform him that a new prince, the name of Doleg, had been installed in Lengthwheel. The imperial agent was also present, of course. He would take charge of sending the document in when it was completed, though he himself would not sign it. It was possible in theory for the imperial agent to send a note recommending that the emperor reject the latest prince, but the agent would hesitate to do so. Such an act would require that the emperor actually be notified, and an imperial decision required, to be backed up with troops if necessary. Worst of all, it would not be good for an imperial agent's career to suggest that he actually needed troops to keep matters running smoothly in his territory. He was expected to be adroit enough politically to see to it that no clique or party might go counter to imperial wishes, ever gain sufficient power to do much. This could include actual assassinations, never done in such a way that the empire could be blamed. In the case of the principality, the most recent such severe measures had taken place back in Doleg's grandfather's day. Although most of the Osbands understood that the empire had been behind the death of Osband Solani, it had always been best to believe otherwise. Stories repeated memories of the slaughters committed by the warrior emperor were still too prevalent to risk imperial wrath. For all the extensive territory of the principality, Doleg knew from Boreas that the post of the imperial agent of Lengthwheel was considered a sign of imperial disfavor, or at least a sign of lack of political influence. It goes back to the warrior empire, the old scholar had said. The man was a military genius, but he did such a fine job of depopulating the principality in some parts that some parts of it are still not quite recovered. An imperial agent here can still enrich himself, but nowhere near so easy as in some places. Further, because the country is so poor, it's hardly worth the trouble for the emperor to hold on to it. He'll send troops to retain it if he has to, simply because it would be a bad precedent to lose any piece of imperial territory, but he won't like it. He lifted a motionary finger. This does not mean that the agent is harmless. Far from it. It is in his best interest to have an effective intelligence system, to know what is going on, and to stop trouble before it starts. Though the emperor may not forgive the agent, he will stand behind that agent, and simply because that agent represents him, and an affront to the agent is an affront to the emperor. To know that the agent will lose his place is no comfort to all the dead, widows, orphans, or farmers whose fields are destroyed. Now that the last of the Osmonds had signed the document, and that part of the matter was done, tradition held on that one approach to Prince on business the day of the prince's ascension. Boreas had had a word on that as well. I believe that the tradition began long ago, in the days when the Lantha Confederation were still on the high plains. Because of the nature of their society, some chief would naturally have objections to the accession of any one of their number. The chieftains themselves, who were just feeling their way into the position, as it were, would turn down most immediate petitions, simply to demonstrate that they felt powerful enough to do so. So the tradition began in self-interest. Don't ask the chieftain for anything on his ascension day because he's likely to turn you down. As many such things go, it later became simply the thing done, with no thought of the reasons behind it. For most Osmonds, likely for all, the origin of the tradition is lost. If we were to go out onto the high plains among the Nanissas, one would find similar sorts of habit, and possibly even larger numbers of people who understand what is behind these habits. However, it had come about, it gave him little time to gather his wits and start becoming used to being the prince, the one responsible for all the decisions. On the other hand, the imperial agent was not bound by tradition. As a representative of the emperor, he might make whatever decisions he chose and present messages and representations at whatever time he felt best. And here he came with a small scroll in his hand. Prince Doleg, my felicitations. I have a message from the emperor, and I hope to have our response soon. He wore brocaded robes of green and gold, as befit his station, and his slim, beak-nosed face was calmly smiling. It seemed an appropriate expression for a man with the might of the emperor backing him. Thank you, Osmond Oringfa. I receive it and will respond in due course. As the agent bowed himself out of the prince's presence, the Doleg wondered, what is it now? Certainly not good wishes from the emperor, but I refused to open the thing immediately. He went out the door behind the throne. Then, with his guards following closely, he went through the corridors to his quarters. He wouldn't move into the prince's suite toward his rooms, not until after the funeral. Padre Blue Sky was with him, as well as the 4-man guard detachment. Ordinarily, there was not such much danger to a prince in his own palace, but even in the most ordinary times, the prince would not walk around his own palace without a guard. He was even well less advised to go without a guard in the time immediately following his accession, things being in a state of a flux. Doleg knew he would do well to remember that the accession was not complete until after the funeral, when the rest of the Osmonds would sign the document. One guard checked to see that his chamber was empty. Then the detachment took their positions outside the door, while Padra and Doleg went in. So, I wonder what was so important that Oring Fa couldn't wait an extra day to deliver it. He broke the seal and opened the scroll. It took a minute to work his way through the flowery, bureaucratic phrasing. Then he went through it once more just to be certain. Third God's toe! Bad news? Padra's eyebrows lifted. Bad news? I don't know what they're thinking down there in Medagalis. Listen to this. To the Honorable Prince Twarda, greetings. It has been reported that you have increased the size of your army. It would therefore seem that your taxes to the Emperor could also be increased. Exact figures will be sent to you in due course. Long live the Emperor! I won't bother trying to make out the signature of the functionary who signed this. What do they think their armies are being used for down here? Nice parades up and down our streets. What we're doing is holding back the Golani and his Denisas. Keeping them their side of the frontier. Every copper they take from us in taxes makes it that much harder to keep men in the field. And now they want more. He crushed the scroll in his fist and flung it against the wall. I think I'm going to have to visit the Imperial agent and ask for his assistance again. He's never given it in the past, but perhaps I could get him to at least come out and look over the frontier. Maybe the remains of a village burnt out by the Denisas might change his mind? Or would he see anything but what the Emperor has commanded him to see? Hermione sat back and tried to relax. The main trouble was that she was alone here, with very little in the way of companionship. Being betrothed to the late prince gave her some sort of vague and indefinable status. As the daughter of Osmond Chillard, she had learned long ago how to tell who was cultivating her friendship, and who was cultivating someone who might be of use to her. And she'd also given up, many years back, being disappointed at how few real friends she could count. She was surprised to see how many women, in light of her terribly uncertain status, seemed to have a feeling that she might, at some time, be able to do something for them, or their husbands, or their sweethearts. Truly, having been betrothed to the prince, any union found for her would be with another powerful person. It seemed to make good political sense, then, to try and stay on her good side. She was also wary of accepting one person's view of the situation. What she heard would most certainly be slanted in the direction of what the speaker wished her to believe. For certain, there would be some politics on which each person would be neutral, but the difficulty would be determining which topics those might be, and where she was getting her biased information. She was too new in town yet for her servants to have made connections with the servants of others, after which time Gurmy could tell her many things that were known, not necessarily the things someone wanted her to believe. Well, there were things she could do, even so, to begin the process. Gurmia, she said to her maid, have someone send for Captain Drizzt to come in to see me. Yes, Osmony. In her discussions with people, the bald question, who killed the prince, was a query that could arouse the wrong sort of interest. She had managed, feigning innocent horror, to ask the rhetorical question here and there, who could do such a terrible thing as to send a Pranchka after the prince? It was the sort of question that required the hearer to agree that it was a terrible thing indeed. She'd been able to learn a little from the responses, if only about the person who spoke to her. Many people distrusted the old tutor Borelus, who everyone knew was a magician. He'd been close to the two brothers, Dolag and Torda, though perhaps a little closer to Dolag. He sometimes wore the robes of an imperial scholar, and everyone knew he must have committed some crime to have been exiled to Langthguil. This was not a reassuring sort of news. Ah, and here was Captain Drizzt, leaning on his crutch. His lame leg was cased in a splint of wooden rods sewed at intervals into a leather case, which is strapped around the leg. He was an older man, and hair liberally sprinkled with white, and a little ill at ease in front of Hermione. Please sit down, Captain. No, sit down. There's no need for you to wear you out with standing on that leg just because I wish to speak to you. The captain sat on a stool, still obviously not liking the notion. Now, Captain, how are the men getting on? Have they had a chance to start making friends among the garrison yet? Well, it's a little early for that, Osmony. We've been here bare a week so far. Haven't had to break up any fights between ours and theirs yet, though. And that's a good news of a sort. I see. Well, Captain, we are alone among strangers. I know I state the obvious, but in this situation, I find myself lacking sources of information. Even soldiers' gossips might be useful, if only to tell me what people are saying. I would hope to be able to sort through whatever comes in, and perhaps find here and there a useful nugget. The captain frowned and thought. I'll ask the lads then. Do that. Here's a silver imperial. Tell them it's a present in thanks for bringing me here safely. Tell them as well that I'll be grateful for any news they might bring in. You may also want to let them know I'm not a fool. Making up stories they think I might like to hear is not going to make me happy. Put it in your own words, but let them know that I am at present satisfied with the standard of their appearance and bearing, and don't feel extra drill is necessary. Captain smiled slightly. Extra drill? Yes, Osmony, I'll see to that. Very good, Captain. Here's another silver imperial for yourself. Thank you for coming. At your service, Osmony. As the captain went hobbling out, Hermione nodded to herself. Yes, he'd pass along the promise and the threat. Some fool out there would still try to make up stories for her. But a day or two of extra drill would show them that she was not asleep. Yes, some such stories might slip past, but not all. Not by any means. Now came the difficult part, waiting in patience for whatever might come. Osmony? Gurmy came in. It's that Osmony Hallraft again, Osmony. I think you may be best to talk to her. For sure she's cultivating you on behalf of her husband, but she's also got some influence on her own. And if she takes it into her head that she could make things miserable for me, all right, Gurmia, let it show her in. Osmony Rakyov Hallraft was a large woman, but seemed smaller and acted, Hermione thought, like a cheeky sparrow, fluttering here and fluttering there, looking at this and looking at that, but somehow not giving offense. Or not any serious offense in any case. Ah, my dear Osmony Hermione, such a sad circumstance to find yourself in. You'd never laid eyes on the late prince, had you? No, I hadn't. And it was dreadfully hard to consider oneself in mourning for a person one had never met. Ah, well, don't you worry. There'll be a man wanting to make alliance with such a man as your father. You'll see. If you're still unmarried in a year's time, I'll be surprised. Thank you, Osmony Hallraft. It wouldn't do to declare that she didn't really want to marry anyone. I don't suppose that you've had the chance to see much of the city yet? You know, we have some buildings here that have been preserved almost unchanged from the days of the Empire. Really? Architecture was not one of Hermione's great delights, but she knew how to feign an interest in things as well as any, and better than most. I'm afraid I'm not familiar with imperial architecture. Perhaps you could take me on a tour sometime and show me the main features? Up on the border, unfortunately, architects were less concerned with beauty and more with defense. From the stories, there have been bandits coming across the Clem from the time when Medolgalas was just one more large town down south. After a bit of discussion, a tentative agreement was made for a sightseeing expedition sometime in the future, and Osmony Hallraft took her leave. Tevatru looked at the message. This is not good news. Not only has the army been thrown back, but the Gishnapas are investing Pinyolgas. This cannot be allowed. It was still early enough in his reign that a military disaster might be in trouble for him. What preparations have been made to rectify this? He demanded. The man who had brought the message from the magician who monitored the silver lump stiffened. Tentative orders have been issued for the dispatch of a further army to the southwest, August ruler. Your command alone is necessary to make the order official. Let it be done, then. There's a little stir among those present. Clearly, some would have preferred to discuss the matter further. No, he had made the decision. He refused to seem vacillate. He acted as though he had noticed nothing. I shall require a detailed report on what has occurred in the southwest. Yes, august ruler. The Empire has trouble on the southwestern border, Borla said. Yes, I know it's a rare year when there's neither trouble nor rumor of trouble there. But you may believe that the trouble is now more serious than it has been. As one evidence of the trouble, Noring Fa has been required to send a large draft of troops back across the strait. Third God's toe, they'd be sending drafts up there to help us fight the Nissas. Third God's toe, they should be sending drafts up here to help us fight the Nissas. Instead, we get troop withdrawals and increased taxes? Well, as to that, I have an item here which might be of some use to you. That odd-shaped bundle? What is it? Some kind of amulet to protect against Nissas? The old magician looked up momentarily from his unwrapping. In a sense, yes. But there is nothing of what you call magic in this. Ah, here we are. A crossbow, Borlis? This is your great invention? A Nissa can practically empty his quiver while a crossbowman is cocking his crossbow. Look closely, Prince. Surely you don't think I'd produce something as simple as all that. Tell me, what is the advantage of a crossbow? That it is easier to learn to effectively use than a bow? It also has a longer range, depending on the strength of the bow, but it is slower to ready for shooting. I know that. Now, I have developed a method to deal with that. Watch. He took hold a loop of metal just forward of the bow staff and pulled it up. It was a lever, pivoting up from back further on the forestock, and as it came up, another rod with a semicircular end pivoted out of the lever, catching the string and pushing it back on the trigger mechanism. I must confess that to make it feasible to cock the bow thus, the bow could not be as strong as it might. But if you have a sufficient number of men trained to use these, and trained to use them in sequence, one might be shooting while another was cocking, in which case they could be effective. As you said yourself, training a man to use one of these is a much shorter process than training a bowman. Doleg took the weapon, handled it, aimed it, and considered the uses to which it might be put. Perhaps not a complete solution to the Nissa bow's immobility, but it might go far to even things up. I'm led to believe, Lord Prince, that the imperial taxes are rising. Doleg frowned. It wasn't that it was not on Hollowrath's business, just that it was something Hollowrath ought not to have found out just yet. He could almost forgive the man, though, having the taxes raised was a serious matter. Let me tell you in confidence, Hollowrath, that the Empire has raised our taxes. I have not yet decided what my response will be to that. What possible response could there be? Where will we be if the Emperor sends his troops to collect the taxes? That has always been on our minds, hasn't it? There are still places in Lengthwheel that haven't fully recovered from the destruction wrought by the warrior emperor. I wonder if a century and a half is sufficient time to live in fear of his return. The man himself is long dead and gone to ashes. His descendants, given the way the imperial crown passes, are hardly any of his blood. But they have the army, and they can usually find someone competent to run it. I don't advise rebellion, Lord Prince. No, it's not foolish to think of us fighting the Emperor and the Nissas both at the same time. I might ask for a mitigation of the taxes in face of the troubles we face. He gave Osban a grim look. Be careful who you tell and what you tell them. If rumors start going around that I plan a rebellion, I will not be happy with you. Yes, Lord Prince. Hollowrath's expression stayed neutral, but Doleg was certain the message had gotten across. This prince business has some definite drawbacks, Padya. I can't go crawling the wine shops with you anymore. Not with a squad of armed guards around at all times. Even when I go into the alley to relieve myself. Well, somebody's got to be Prince. You do as well as anyone, Lord Prince. You know, you could call me by my name, at least when we're alone. It doesn't seem right, Lord Prince. Doleg narrowed his eyes. How would it be if I gave you a royal command not to use my title? Padre grinned. Now there's a notion. Reversed enforcement of protocol? Most people get punished if they don't give you your title. I get the chop if I do? You never were like all the others, were you, Dolia? I wasn't. What makes you say that? What makes me say that? Come on, Dolia. Little things like developing tactics to fight the Ninissas and getting the army to use those tactics halfway effectively? Little things like that. It was obvious to anyone that the way we were doing things wasn't working. Could anyone figure out what to do about it, though? Still haven't, Padya. We can cut off little bands of them and harass their foraging parties, but pitched battles are still a risk. You're actually going to use those crossbow things? The sudden change of subject didn't really catch Doleg by surprise. Is there some difficulty with the requisition? Padra shrugged. Only the usual. It's new, so I don't like it attitude. I think you're optimistic about 20,000 men armed with them next spring. Keep at the workmen, get as many of these things made as you can. There may be a bit of trouble getting old soldiers to take them, but keep harping on their virtues. Recruits, well, by the time they've been wearing themselves out, learning how to march and set up camp, they've learned not to argue when someone shoves a crossbow at them and says, "This is your weapon, take good care of it and learn how to use it." All right, but I still have my doubts about a scholar and magician, no matter how learned, actually being able to design a useful weapon. Any weapon is useful if you take advantage of its strong points. Osmond Isder was tall and slender, with white hair and a beard still showing a few traces of reddish brown. Lord Prince, there are still some Osmonds who have not sent in promises of allegiance. Is that a very serious matter, Isder? It is winter after all, and travel along some roads is nigh on impossible. It may not be a very serious matter, Lord Prince, and on the other hand, it might be very serious. Lantha Osmonds are a fractious and independent lot. The ascension of a new prince may be seen as a time to press certain desires, possibly even to unseat the prince himself. With the Ninissas swarming over the border, people will disunite us further? Perhaps not in the east, where people are more aware of the danger, but in the northwest, for instance, where the Ninissas are a far distant threat? People do not always do the sensible thing, not when there is a possibility of power at hand. Doleg nodded. Our history is coming back to bite us. The Lantha Confederacy was a disparate group of clans and tribes, whose only common feature was a life on the high plains, in a time of drought requiring them to find new lands. So one of their number hammered together an alliance to come down and invade imperial territory. Having won their territory, each tribe and clan sought its own independence, even in the face of warrior emperors. So, here we stand today, just barely united. If you say so, Lord Prince. Doleg looked at the Osman. Yes, I forget. Not everyone has had the benefit of Borealis' instruction. Yes, that was the way of it. The Northwest was a special case, which describes the whole. The people there are large and sturdy built, fair skin, either black or red hair, and when they speak Lantha, it's peppered with words and phrases unknown in the rest of the land. I'm led to understand they're always jealous of their own prerogatives and entirely willing to press for more. They've never been strong enough, nor capable of sufficiently strong alliances to press for what they'd really like, the principality itself. Let's hope their poor political sense keeps them from making an alliance against us. Yes, your brother found it advisable to make Tafral his heir, something that would bring the principality under Ladavant and his descendants in the years to come. Can you imagine the disappointment that Ladavant would feel on hearing Tuardo was marrying again? Doleg pursed his lips. A great come down from father of the prince to father-in-law of the prince's stepsister. But is it more to the tale than that? You must admit that so far, all we have is historical feelings and suppositions. I understand that, Lord Prince, and I have people urgently seeking proof, one way or another. All I have at present is the report of an unguarded word spoken in the hearing of an Osban Ladavant regarding the prince robbing him by marrying again. Who knows what the servant actually heard? He paused a moment. It might be as well to do something about Osban Ladavant. He is a disappointed man, and disappointed men can be dangerous. Dolag considered, then shook his head. I don't think I'd like to begin my reign by killing disappointed Osbands, just in case they might be dangerous in the future. We're going to have to fight the Nanissas, and I want men behind me who aren't just following for fear of me. Mind, I want them to know that they can't get away with anything they please. If I have to execute someone, I'll do it. Thank you for attending me, Lord Oringfa. My duty, Lord Prince. As you are no doubt aware, Lord, the Emperor has raised our taxes once more. We will be seriously hindered in our efforts against the Nanissas if we are required to pay more to the Empire. I ask that you pass on to the Emperor a request that our taxes be mitigated. The Imperial agent frowned slightly. The Emperor is fighting against the Gishnabas in the southwest, Lord Prince. I doubt such a request will be well received. Lord Oringfa, would you like to see the Nanissas setting up their tents in the ruins of Plutarch? Without some understanding from the Emperor, that will be the result. Will you pass on the request? Oh yes, Lord Prince. I will pass on the request with your current concerns. But be prepared to pay the taxes. Thank you, Oringfa. We're going to have trouble. I get the impression from Oringfa that we'll be having to pay the new taxes whether we like it or not. Padra scowled. They don't understand, do they? No. I explained to Oringfa the danger from the Nanissas, but he acted as if he didn't think it was a concern. With all the reports they get back on everything and everybody, you'd think they'd get reports on the Nanissa as well. At least a report on the Battle of Lame Creek. One might have thought, Borla said, that they'd have a care just when and how much pressure to put on us. If they're busily at war with the Gishnabas, as a war my sources say is not going well, why would they risk disaffection in another part of the Empire? Perhaps the fact that they're taking a risk is an indication of how badly things are going, that they need the money that desperately. You mean that this would be an opportune moment to refuse to pay? Use the money to finance a proper campaign against the Nanissas, then some 3 to 5 years later send a large gift with apologies in hopes of mollifying the Emperor? Something along those lines. But would the Emperor truly be mollified? Well, that would be a question for the future then, wouldn't it? If they send another army in 3 to 5 years' time, Doleg shot a look at Padra. Then we'll deal with it at that time. Are you still afraid of the warrior Emperor? Padra glared. We've been through this before. I don't wet my pants thinking about an imperial invasion, but there are some among your Osbands who come near to it. Some memories last a long time. Sorry, Padra, I shouldn't have said that. One big trouble is that I need a year to make sure of the principality. See to it that all my Osbands are following me, or at least not too afraid of me not to do anything else. But I don't think the Nanissas are going to allow me that time. He grinned at Borlas. Borlas, you don't suppose you can make me an amulet against Nanissas? It's good that you're smiling when you say that, Prince Doleg. It saves me from the long lecture on the possibilities and impossibilities of magic. You can be sure that if I can find any means, magical, mechanical, or alchemical, to make it matters easier for you, I will do so. How do things go for you with the other servants, Gurmia? Do they talk to you? Yes, Osbani. At least most of them do. You're still important enough, or at least new enough, that people want to know more about you. So you tell them? Only the kinds of things you want them to know, Osbani. Just enough so they don't lose interest and stop talking to me. What have you been able to learn from them? Not much, Osmony. The biggest story going around, almost to the exclusion of all else, is that the Emperor is going to raise taxes again. The way I've heard it, he said that since the prince can afford such large armies, he can afford to pay more taxes. Hertha frowned. My father always said that the taxes were too high already, she smiled. No, he didn't exactly discuss it with me, but I heard about it this way and that. Yes, Osmony. Gurmy gave a small smile, then suppressed it. Nothing about who killed the prince? That's mostly yesterday's news, Osmony. It would be noticed if I pushed at it. Most seem convinced that Prince Doleg had it done. After all, he always hangs around with that Borelus, the old magician from the Empire. Lord Prince, there's a deputation of citizens to see you. They're concerned about the spread of the belief of this third god. Doleg looked up from the desk full of papers. What had my brother told them, Osmond Holleraft? Your late brother, Lord Prince, had been careful to make no decision whatsoever. When asked, he declared he was taking the matter under consideration. How many of these third godders do we have in Lankswheel anyway? As many as a quarter of the population that either believe in the third god or have some sympathy with their beliefs, Lord Prince. So many? Yes, Lord Prince, that is an estimate. The numbers vary. In the cities and town, they may be numerous, but there are some parts There are some parts of the back country they are not known at all. For all that, there are parts of the back country where the divine pair gets scant observance, and the spirits of wind, water, fire, and stone still rule. I will admit that I know little of this third god. What attracts people to his worship, anyway? I'm not certain, Lord Prince, myself. I think it has to do with these festivals of theirs, drunken debauchery and all, so I've heard. People will hold to this faith despite their detestation of their neighbors, even so far as physical violence, and all that for the sake of holding wild parties? It doesn't sound reasonable. Osmond Holleraft shrugged. I can't say that, Lord Prince, never having been to one of their meetings. All I can tell is what I've heard. Send in the deputation. I'll talk to them and see just what I can do. The deputation consisted of 3 men, one of whom, a magistrate, tall, gray-haired, and with great dignity, spoke for the whole group. Lord Prince, I'm Albakar, one of the magistrates of this town, and with me are Tashvik, a stonecutter. He indicated a husky man of middle age, and Norston, a silversmith. He indicated with a hand a gray-haired, wizened man. We are greatly concerned, Lord Prince, that with the continued spread of this pernicious belief in a so-called third god. We have come to you humbly to request that something be done about them. Doleg leaned back in his chair. What great evil have they done? Lord, their presence alone is a danger. They are not welcome in the Empire, and many have fled to Lankswheel, hoping to find a place here. By their presence they mock the divine pair, and invite the wrath of God and Goddess upon us. You have evidence of the anger of the divine pair? Lord Prince, there has been drought in some places, plague and livestock in others, for which omens have been taken and demonstrated the annoyance of the god and goddess. Furthermore, Lord Prince, all know that we are under attack by the Nanissas, who ravage the land, destroying towns and cities. What further proof is needed? I see. Who carried out the search for the omens? Honest priests of the divine pair, Lord Prince. I see. Of course. Honest priests of the divine pair could scarcely refrain from finding worshippers of the third god at fault, could they? Lord Prince! Listen to me, magistrate. I would have you draw up a paper giving all the evidence you have it brought to me, and I will give it my most careful consideration. Lord Prince, your late brother had already taken the matter under consideration some time ago. The magistrate stopped suddenly, fully aware that he was treading on dangerous ground. But I am not my late brother, am I? Doleg asked mildly. I have no idea how he felt in the matter, and therefore I must make up my own mind. You may go. And that is all for today. So thank you all for tuning in, and tune in next week when I have another chapter for you. Take care.